believe that only 144,000 people will go to heaven. They claim that everyone else, even faithful believers, will cease to exist when they die, and some will eventually be resurrected to live forever on a restored paradise earth. According to their teaching, heaven just isn't in the cards for most Christians. Instead, it's reserved for a very small group of people known as the anointed. Jehovah's Witnesses believe that some Christians today are still part of this group, and that you can know for certain if you're part of the 144,000.
How does a person know clearly whether he or she has the heavenly calling? Such ones have knowledge. They know for a certainty. They've been anointed. So anointed ones don't need confirmation from anyone else. Their anointing is clear, true, affirmative.
But when you actually read the passages where that 144,000 number comes from, you'll notice something odd. And when you look at what the Jehovah's Witness organization has historically taught about the 144,000, it gets even weirder. So let's take a close look at this doctrine and figure out where it comes from, how Jehovah's Witnesses interpret it, and why Christianity as a whole disagrees. Because when you follow the logic of this teaching, it leads to some very strange conclusions. Before we go any further, if you enjoy content like this, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. So first things first, where do Jehovah's Witnesses even get this 144,000 number from? The number is mentioned just twice in the Bible. Both of those mentions come from the book of Revelation. In Revelation 14, we read, "Then I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads." So Jehovah's Witnesses believe this describes a literal number of people who will rule with Christ in heaven. But when you look closely, you start to notice some other details. For example, in Revelation 7, it says that the 144,000 come from the tribes of Israel. 12,000 from each tribe. But Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe that these are literally Jewish believers from those tribes. Instead, they interpret this symbolically. Then, in Revelation 14, the same group is described again. And we read something else interesting. It says they are those who did not defile themselves with women, for they are virgins. Again, Jehovah's Witnesses don't take this literally. But here's the thing. If the number must be taken literally, why does the rest of the description not have to be taken literally as well? Because that would mean that the heavenly group would not only need to be exactly 144,000, but that it would also need to be made up of celibate Jewish men. Instead, almost everything in the passage is treated symbolically, except the number. That's one of the problems with this teaching, but it's far from the only one. The other problem is that nowhere in the New Testament do we see a clear teaching that Christians have two completely different hopes. One for an anointed heavenly class, and one for everyone else. There's no talk of some Christians going to heaven while others live forever on earth. When you read the New Testament, many passages speak about heaven as a place that all believers will go. For example, Jesus tells his disciples in John 14 that in my Father's house are many rooms. I go to prepare a place for you. And Paul writes in Philippians 3 verse 20 that our citizenship is in heaven. These passages don't seem to describe an exclusive, small class of believers. They just speak to Christians as a whole. Jehovah's Witnesses respond by saying that these passages apply only to the anointed class, the 144,000 who will rule with Christ in heaven. In other words, these promises are supposedly not meant for most believers. But this explanation raises two important questions. First, where does the Bible actually say that? Because none of these passages say that they apply only to a special group. They're simply addressed to believers. Nowhere do we find a specific witness teaching. For the first 19 centuries of Christianity, there was only one calling, a heavenly one. Specifically, the Watchtower says, for 19 centuries there was only the one calling, the heavenly one, with Jehovah being very selective as to who would serve with his son to make up the kingdom government. Many would be invited, but only a precious few chosen. In other words, Jehovah's Witnesses teach that the only Christian calling for nearly 2,000 years was to be among the 144,000 who would rule in heaven with Christ. Now think about what that implies. If only 144,000 people could receive the heavenly calling over the first 1,900 years of Christianity, then that's no more than 75 Christians per year. Even less, actually, because Jehovah's Witnesses believe that quota still hasn't been filled today. So supposedly, only a handful of people through the first 1,900 years of Christianity may have qualified for heaven. And that claim gets even bolder when you try to square it with early Christian history, because Christianity spread rapidly across the Roman Empire, and many believers didn't just adopt the faith, they were willing to suffer and die for it. Watchtower publications themselves acknowledge that the number of Christian martyrs in the early centuries was enormous. For example, one Watchtower article discussing early persecution states that during the reign of Emperor Diocletian, hundreds of thousands of Christians across the empire were brutally persecuted. Some were burned, some were drowned, some were executed publicly. In fact, according to that Watchtower article, 144,000 Christians were killed in Egypt alone during that persecution. Which is ironic, because if you think about it for a second, that number, 144,000, is the entire heavenly total according to Jehovah's Witnesses. Yet there were that many Christians dying for their faith in just one instance of historical persecution. If none or very few of these early believers were part of the heavenly hope, then who exactly were the real Christians? The Watchtower addresses this by saying that many of these early believers were only professed Christians who were not in line for the high calling in Christ.